Hello, back again to Bergson and the holographic theory of mind, the ongoing series, part 26, titled The Memory of Spiders, which is really going to be a reflection on human memory, the problem of instinct, and the question of whether or not even motor memory, as some have called it, can be stored. So we'll be looking at Lashley's alternate implication in the experiments we've discussed previously, and we'll be looking at actual building of a web in the spider world, and the whole difficulty of instinctive memory. How is it stored and passed from generation to generation of spiders, or birds, or amoebas? And this comes down to the fundamental problem with DNA as a memory transmission device. Then we'll be looking at the notion of four-dimensional field, with DNA as a possible index into this. The whole difficulty of motor memory as mechanisms that are actually formed, stored, constructed in the brain. For example, playing a piano concerto. And the notion of the complexity of the brain as ultimately obscuring the past. So Bergson distinguished two forms of memory. We've noted this earlier, part 4, part 5, also 13. One being motor memory, which is an actual mechanism in the brain, the other experience. So motor memory, also called procedural memory in scientific literature, or habit memory earlier, it would be considered a modification of the brain's neural networks, something like a connectionist net, very much like deep learning. So it's like a mechanism, as Bergson described it, can be unrolled at will, your tennis serve, or the end result of many practice sessions of Chopin's piano waltz in C-sharp minor, where ultimately I can just unroll this learned mechanism of the waltz. Experience, the other form of memory, or also called episodic memory, as Tulving called it, and I'll say sort of because it's not quite the same, is not stored in the brain. It's rather in the 4D extent of being, or the universal field itself. There lies every experience of practicing the waltz. The day you were grumpy, the day it was storming outside, or the day your piano teacher was furious, or all of the above. These two systems are also called System 1, the motor memory or habit memory or procedural memory, and System 2, the memory of experience or episodic memory, in a rather famous article by Sperry and Schachter in 1987. But after Bergson, there was Lashley. And Lashley, of course, did his research after Bergson wrote most of his works, especially after Bergson did all of his research on scientific findings on memory and memory phenomena. So Bergson, being the great exponent of the idea that philosophy should be tied to the fact, and he's particularly talking about the facts of science, would have been greatly interested in Lashley's findings, and it would have been interesting to see what he said, how he might have modified his theory, especially with respect to whether even motor memory is stored in the brain, as we shall see. So as we discussed in number 25, Lashley did experiments with the rats, and he trained them to learn a discrimination task. Now initially, in 25, I took a little bit of liberty and simply called the discrimination task something like distinguishing between a triangle and a circle as to which one, if I picked it, got me the hamburger. And in reality, Lashley was using a maze. So what he did is cut out parts of the brain as we saw, to see if he could destroy the memory, the ability of the rat to get to the hamburger. And no matter how much he sliced, he could not destroy this memory. He sliced and diced every possible way he could conceive of. And this led to his view that memories could be distributed over the brain, or at least any area of the brain, particularly a functional area, was equivalent. It could serve to support the memory. And depending, of course, on where the slices and cuts were made, there was different types of phenomenon. That is, the rat could get there very haltingly or in a spasmodic way, but nevertheless, he got there. The memory wasn't gone. Just the way he got there was affected. So this idea that any part of the area seems to serve the memory already seems somewhat holographic. And this we saw was Pribram's direction in number 25. That is, he started looking to see how it is that the brain could seem to affect this, shall we call it, well, equivalence principle. But there's another interpretation. Rather than distributed, what if the memory is not stored in the brain at all? What if the perceptual guides in the maze, the corners, the texture cues in the maze that are linked to taking certain motor actions and the linkage of the motor actions themselves, what if none of these are stored? Consider something disconcerting. Remember the deep learning nets that we discussed in number 23. There we describe nets that can classify a set of numbers 0 through 9 appropriately. And we discussed the matrix mathematics that underlies this. So, for example, we would have a set of pixels, 28 by 28 in this case, with an embedded 9. And given 28 by 28, we needed 784 input neurons at that first level and lesser thereafter. And given sufficient iterations of training, the net could take that 9 and classify it as a 9. Or if the input was a 7, it could classify it appropriately as a 7. Or the input of 3, it could classify it appropriately as a 3. The slicing and dicing of the rat's brains in Lashley's case was so thorough that to your average deep learning neural net, Lashley had already in 1929, 1930, had effectively done this. He'd cut the net and all those connections into smithereens. And that net depends precisely on those connections rigidly being maintained, or the whole weighting scheme starts to go kaflooey. So there's no way the net could now correctly classify the numbers. Now the above net is a fixed circuit, or set of fixed circuits, if you want to look at it that way. And I think we could already begin entertaining whether this is actually a possibility at all. Is there possibly a rigid permanent connection set? Because the brain is actually a very fluid mass, constantly changing. It is trillions of particles, an enormous number of cells, and in those cells is a scene of constant flux, ribbons of molecules being transported in various spots, little structures changing. It's a constant scene of transition, motion, and transformation. And forewarning, we're going to hit this difficulty in spades coming up. Lashley had already concluded the worst. That is, there are no learned, stored, engraved circuits such as these networks represent. He wondered if some kind of field was responsible for the remembering. To quote, we have to consider that there are fields of force operating in the brain. A field or set of fields impressing itself or themselves on the neural mass, supporting the rat getting through the maze. Perhaps an electromagnetic field. Another thing guided this conclusion. for he had not only slashed, sliced, or removed chunks from every cortical area, but also from the motor areas. And if there was learning anywhere, he said it had to be in the motor areas. If there had to be formation of rigid new circuits that supported that behavior, it had to be in the motor area. If there were learned circuits, learned, newly engraved, engraved is a good word here because ultimately this was called the engram, new conductance paths, it had to be here. Yet the rats could be virtually completely motor disabled or severely motor degraded via the slicing. Yet a rat would literally roll itself to the hamburger or pull itself along by its front feet. Nothing stopped Mr. Rat. It would have used crutches to get there if it had to. It was clear no specific links, no engravings or engrams of rigid connections were being created and stored. And yet this was, and still is, the doctrine. Rigid connections, just as we just saw in the deep learning net. Again, the question was there some sort of field, perhaps an electromagnetic field, driving the remembering behavior? So Sperry, Roger Sperry, in 1955, tested the EM field hypothesis. He used cats in form recognition tests. His intent was to disrupt any operation of an electromagnetic field, quote, transitory EM fields arising between nerve cells, unquote. He made tiny crisscross cuts to the visual cortex. He riddled it with tantalum wires to short circuit any fields. And then, to make matters worse, he implanted leaves of mica to stop transverse currents. So in other words, he did anything he could to make sure that he had disrupted any possibility of EM fields operating. And the cats showed no loss in form discrimination. They could still remember that it was the triangle that led to the hamburger and distinguish between the triangle, the square, the circle, and the star, as an example. So Sperry concluded, well, EM fields are not involved. And form perception, he speculated, depends on information traveling to small cortical regions via links below the gray matter, that is, below the cortex. So he's trying to envision very small regions still in operation, despite the crisscross cuts, etc., that he had inflicted on the brain. So this is to say, the wiring of the brain for Sperry is fixed. Now, I forgot to mention that Sperry is noted for the discovery of the hemispheric split brain function, left and right functionality differing in the hemispheres. And so he showed also that if you cross-wired the left and the right hemispheres, that they could not resume their original functionality. That is, the left hemisphere, which is oriented toward language and logic and reasoning, couldn't get that back again, or vice versa, the right hemisphere, more intuitive, spatial, perceptual, could not either. So again, this seemed to be proof of fixed circuits. Though again, you could just ask, or is this just a major constraint, one of several major constraints that simply cannot be violated, i.e. the functionality assigned to the hemispheres. But this is where it ended. But there's just one problem. Sperry did not make Lashley's findings go away. He showed that EM fields are not involved, but this question remains. Where is the memory? What is the memory? Why can't we get rid of the memories through all this cutting, slicing, and dicing? That remains. With Mr. Rat, we had a simple behavior. Perception of the maze, its cues, and then the sequence of actions, turns to navigate to the hamburger. And so we look at the great complexity of our neural mass, 100 billion neurons. Surely we say, these learned connections must be stored there. This is our belief, our hypothesis. But in reality and equally, it's just a dogma. Remembering Lashley, we actually don't know. Yet in the world of very small beings, there are extremely complex behaviors that make this particular one of Mr. Rat look elementary. And this is where we're going to bring in the spiders, Mr. Spider and his web. So in what follows, I'm going to be following much of the brilliant exposition of this subject by Carl Gunther in his book, Mind, Memory, and Time, which I recommend highly, especially as an exemplar of very concrete thinking, concrete analysis and examples of problems such that one can clearly get beyond abstractions that are obscuring things and look at the reality of the concrete difficulties we're facing. It's an exemplar book in that regard. So here's the problem. Web building is passed from generation to generation, from daddy spider to baby spider, or mommy spider to baby spider. Baby spider can do it, can make a web without any training as soon as he starts. How is this memory stored, this complex skill? And as we'll see, it's complex. Via what storage medium is it passed along? Well, there's one answer. On a strand of DNA between mom and baby. So DNA bears this burden of the passing of this memory and of this skill. So this memory of web building is seen as that of a programmed automaton driven by genetically programmed fixed neural circuitry. We probably quite nicely think that a robo-arachnid is no problem creating one, done easily. So let's scale this web building up to human size. We're looking at a 6-foot human or 72 inches. This is the thought experiment that Gunther has us engage in. So a 1-inch orb weaver, up there on the top, spins a 15-inch web. So 15 inches scaled up by 72 is going to give us a 90-foot diameter web at our scale. So we'll need 2 huge redwoods with, say, 300 feet of clearing between them. And to compensate for our weight, well, we'll let ourselves use a hoist to pull ourselves up and traverse the web's lines. Oh, and we'll need a blindfold because this is how spiders do it. They don't need to see. This is our first web. So we studied tons of how-to videos. We've even got a diagram that we sketched on a napkin at the restaurant. So to start, we must cast the topmost line and from one tree to another. Normally, it would float in the breeze to the other side. So we must know the air currents. It must be the proper height, for it will support the whole web, that first line from tree to tree. And when it catches on the other opposite tree, we'll pull it tight and then anchor it. Then we'd have to crawl across with a much thicker, stronger line, which will be the actual bridge line. Alternatively, we could have crawled up the vegetation or up those trees, leaping over the space, all the while keeping the line untangled. An interesting spatial exercise, and the spider will employ either way. Now the decisions begin anew, and this is something to watch. We're making decision after decision. This cannot be automatic. We must place 12 to 30 radial lines spaced evenly like a wagon wheel. They have no adhesive, so we can crawl up and down these radial lines. After placing one, we decide at the hub where to place the next. And we tug on all the spokes we've placed so far, checking the tension. We check the angle between the two neighbor radials. Say we've done the first two, then we check, or first three, then we check the angles. And if oversized, we'll adjust the next angle to compensate. We repeatedly cut, adjust, even remove the strands to achieve the proper form and tension. And by proper form and tension, we have to have these strands loose enough to not tear by the wind or by any prey slamming against it like a fly. Tight enough for rigidity, can't be too loose. The inner lines must be loose to allow the prey to be trapped, else that prey might just bounce off like a trampoline. With the framework of radial lines completed, we start the circular spiral. So starting at the center, we lay the capture spiral, and it's coated with drops of adhesive, and there'll be roughly 1,000 to 1,500 connection points. Now, this all takes about 25 minutes for a spider. We have a total of 20 meters of thread. Taking our scaling factor, we have about 1,448 meters, or roughly 4,750 feet. Nearly a mile of, in our case, rope. It took us several days. And what did we see? An immense sequence of interdependent steps and decisions, and all this was tailored to the site and conditions. And just look at some of these conditions. Here's another web with a different set of conditions being reacted to, or another based off an arching branch. Or another, with another branch, different spot, or yet another, or another, all different conditions, or yet another. And if these webs are disrupted a couple times, broken, Mr. Spider gets the message. This isn't a good place. These aren't good conditions. And he picks up his whole operation, packs his bag, and moves to a better spot. So we have an idealized image of the web, but this was all tailored to the site and conditions. The spider's web creation is not rigid. It is creatively adaptive. The spider's brain is a pinhead of 13,000 neurons. It's integrating its instinctive, idealized memory of the architecture with the actual conditions and strands laid. But even this is too much. All must be imprinted, but not on the brain, but on the substance of DNA's molecular string. Because it's got to be transmitted to baby. But it is worse. Not only must DNA contain a mechanism for the spider's perception of the web form, but for the motor forces that direct the spider's legs through all these steps. So Gunther has us imagine a puppet moving exercise, a human puppet skeleton to start. So the human body has 600 muscles, and we need then 600 ropes to attach to the bones, so to speak. And pulling the rope will be equivalent to a muscle contraction. Now we'll need 601 friends to pull all the 600 ropes, and the 601st will be a supervisor, coordinator that controls the whole thing. And our task, to get the puppet to stand up. Now one can imagine how difficult this would be. The motor forces on these muscles act in an unlimited number of ways. Each muscle has a vast range of tensions. Each would require a force profile over time. So one can imagine our little graph with a force profile, increasing, decreasing, applied to the muscle over time that each of our 600 people has to respond to and incorporate. Each joint has degrees of freedom: up, down, forward, backwards, sideways, left and right. So each joint has a certain set of degrees of freedom, a space of degrees of freedom. So the limitless possibilities of skeletal motion must be pruned to specific combinations that reach the goal. The combinatorial aspect then is enormous. Now we could conceive of this if the coordinator observes very carefully, watching each failure, issuing new instructions. Say, Sally, pull this hard for 3 seconds, then relax. Now when I said pull this hard, I mean Sally sort of has to be shown very concretely what pulling this hard means, a demonstration of the force. Joe, pull this hard continuously until the puppet is at this point, and then relax. So if the precise total set of instructions can be ascertained and followed, then we could do this. All depends on feedback to the observer and coordinator. And we've learned then this raising our skeletal puppet just to stand up by experience. But Mr. Spider is way worse. Now we have 8 legs, and his 8 shoulders have vertical and horizontal planes of motion like the human shoulder. So there's 8 shoulder joints with this range of motion. There's 56 leg segments. There's 8 claws. Also, the spinnerets through which the spider releases his silk, because the spider is sort of like an organ player that can do things with his feet and hands simultaneously. And that is his spinnerets and his feet simultaneously. And this is just a huge potential space of possible movements. So our team's vastly expanded the numbers task now is make the claws grasp gossamer thin threads of silk. And we add a new constraint. For the team could have no sensory feedback whatsoever. Why is this? It's a constraint straight from genetic theory. The chromosomes with their genes sit within the egg cells. DNA has no awareness of the world. All the memory / experience of web building of all the spiders in the world is of no use, to no avail. Experience cannot be the vehicle for creating instinctive memory. DNA is a long polymer of nucleic acids. It contains codes for the linear structure of proteins. These nucleotides contain no mechanism for absorbing experience. In genetic theory, the flow of info is essentially one way. I'll make a slight modification in a second. There's only one mechanism creating the template for web building in this framework, and that is random mutation of some strand of DNA. Random mutation of some strand of DNA. So yes, it's not entirely one way, as I kind of noted. There is something called reverse transcription, but this is hardly a mechanism for modifying gene experience, and it's quite safe to say that the spider's web building cannot be imprinted on the chromosomes of the egg or sperm. It is not part of the genetic process, this being, number one, random mutation, which gives food to the second, natural selection, where the mutation is then tested in the environment. If the test fails, well, the organism fails. The organism is discontinued because it's not functional. But then going back to our team, given they're blindfolded with no feedback, well, we mutate the DNA that they're representing, so to speak, such that each pulls his rope in a certain way. The spider, we'll say for the sake of argument, which is very likely, fails to move. He is useless. He's not a web builder. He can't crawl in a web. Thus, we have to execute the entire team and start again. Get a new group. Mutate DNA again. It's an interesting question is, are we even mutating a spider? Because of what good is a spider? At least we're mutating a spider that doesn't know how to create a web yet. So anyhow, we mutate the DNA again, test again to see if we can get the spider to move, kill the team, start again, good luck. Felix says, seriously, but this is the model that would get this spider to learn to stand up and then do what we saw necessary, ultimately, to create a web. So in sum, the instruction set, so to speak, that what has to be hard-coded in DNA that builds a spider's web is not simply a series of reflex actions. Rather, it's an attempt to instantiate an ideal architecture. The spider cuts and tailors the lines. He tries to obtain the proper tension and placement. He adjusts and places for conditions. What is the probability that the forces that operate as 8 legs spontaneously associate via random mutation into a harmonious construction of a web? So this brings us to some other species like birds, just for a quick view of this, that the same problem exists. Take bird migration. So this is an instinct involving incredible memory of relationships of things in time and space. It requires a form of chronological precision of memory, essential to navigation. If you trap a pigeon at your feeder and cart him 500 miles away, he'll likely be back in a couple days. So this is what we just described with the pigeon, just homing. And just start there for a moment. Homing. Now, a possible mechanism Gunther sort of visualizes is that the bird's memory contains a precise chronological record of experience, of its experience. At home, he observes the motions of the sun and the moon and the stars over the day and over the night. Add in the Earth's magnetic field, the various landscapes, odors, temperatures, clouds, light patterns. Then, taken to an unknown location, he runs his internal movie versus the information at the new location. He compares, notes the discrepancies, and this makes most sense in the context of this sun, position, stars, etc. And then he flies in the direction to realign the maps. I note here that on the bottom right that Lashley was already here. He had studied bird migration before launching his neural studies. Just fun to see where Lashley was, as you'll see. So were this model correct, you would need extreme precision of the chronological replay. Now, albatrosses were relocated in 1958 by the U.S. Navy. They were bothering the runways at Midway, so they were taken from Midway to the Philippines, and nearly all flew back to Midway, a range of somewhere between 3,200 and 4,000 plus miles, depending on where the albatross had been released. They would have had to sustain this image of moving celestial coordinates for somewhere between 10 and 32 days. Is this memory far-fetched? Well, even in the human context, recall the savants. Oliver Sacks, for example, has a couple of these. In the book is called The Man Without a Hat. And for example, he notes a couple somewhat mentally retarded twins who could recall every event of every day. Given a date, they could recall every event of that day in detail. What they ate for breakfast, what they saw on the news, as though watching an inner movie or panorama unfold before their inner eye. And also he described a guy named Martin A., who was, again, a bit challenged, but nevertheless, he could remember any complete of the 6,000 pages of Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians, because his father had read these to his retarded son every day, and he could remember them in detail. And one could go on and on with these kinds of examples. It's just that they're not pursued, they're considered anomalies. In migration, this information must be in instinctive memory. And yet migration is considered a form of homing that we just described, and this suggests a common mechanism. Yet the memory involved in migration must be loaded on and in DNA. For many bird species migrate instinctively. They travel thousands of miles. The young birds do not need to follow older birds. They don't need the example of older birds. They can get there all by themselves. But once they've got experience, then they can choose. They can use their experience journeys as a guide. So like the spider, they are far from rigid. Overall, instinctive flight paths have the nature of an old memory that can be easily overridden by new experience. Juvenile birds act as though they're recalling a general route from their ancestors and basing this on compass readings oriented to the Earth's magnetic field, movements of the sun and the stars, etc. The juvenile, blown off course, can get lost. The experienced bird can use his memory of past journeys to navigate by homing to the right place. For example, there was a study with starlings in Europe. They were trapped in mid-flight in the Netherlands. They were transported 300 miles south of where they were trapped. Well, the experienced guys adjusted, but the newbies, they were lost. And they simply followed the same directional path, parallel, but 300 miles displaced. So they had no clue where they were. The experience required for homing and migration, for all practical purposes, is identical, interchangeable. And yet, to explain the migration of the young bird, all this must be stored in DNA. The same form of memory that we see operate in homing or experience, yet all must be stored in DNA to account for the newbie. But DNA, again, is one way. Only random mutation can alter this vast migratory program or create it in the first place. Migratory routes have not had millions of years to blindly evolve. 10,000 years ago, North America was under ice, and then the glaciers retreated rapidly. Migration routes changed radically. Even the magnetic field has moved around in the relatively recent past. So we're stretching credulity to the breaking point to think that random mutation somehow adjusted all of these migratory flight paths within 10,000 years, and actually far sooner. To anchor the lower end of the scale, Gunther described Herbert Jennings and his observations of amoebas. The amoeba has no rigid body. It's a transparent blob. Oozes outward like a thin bag of jelly. It moves by thrusting and withdrawing finger-like projections of its membrane. It's too small to be seen by the naked eye, yet it's a slithering dinosaur looking for prey. Jennings wondered, if taken out of their micro-world, would these little folks be seen as intelligent, not dissimilar to dogs or cats? And the answer certainly seemed yes. To quote him, an amoeba proteus was moving towards a euglena cyst. When the anterior edge came in contact with it, the cyst rolled forward and slipped to the left. The amoeba followed. At times, the animal sent out two pseudopodia, one on each side of the cyst, as if trying to enclose the latter. At other times, a single, long, slender pseudopodium was sent out. Only its tip remained in contact. Then the body was brought up from the rear. In other words, he was just using this particular method to keep contact so he didn't lose sight of the cyst. Now, it's always interesting to note where Lashley was already. In this case, he was already here because, again, Lashley was a graduate student under Jennings. In another example of amoeba problem solving, Jennings related how an amoeba folds up a strand of algae several times its own length. It repeatedly extends its membrane arms, grasps the stalk, and pulls it to its body, so the strand rolls up into a tight ball. Viewing this, one would think of human arms pulling in a long rope and rolling it into a bag. Jennings also gave an ooze-by-ooze account of an amoeba battle. A large amoeba, we'll call her Amy, had partially engulfed a part of a medium amoeba, the part being Anne, we'll call her Anne. A thread was left to the medium part, and Anne, the little part, repeatedly tried to get through this opening. Amy, the largest one, outflanked this, biting off the thread, backing up, leaving Anne enclosed. Anne kept throwing out appendages out of the opening, eventually escaping. Amy, realizing this, backed up, overtook, and engulfed Anne. Anne then changed strategy. She rolled up into a ball, went quiet, and rather stoically resisted all digestive attempts. After a bit, as Amy moved, a thin place in her protoplasm was created. Anne must have sensed this and bolted out, leaving Amy surprised and discouraged, with no further pursuit. So memory is essential in all of this. The amoeba's behavior indicates it has a vast memory of its experience. We see in a tiny bag of protoplasm the same things that would indicate the presence of mind that we see in beings like us with 100 billion neuron brains. We see choice, spatial memory, perception, attention, intelligence, moods. And I'm going to remind you, I'm only giving a very small portion of what Gunther went through in describing what Jennings saw. But the question then is, where in this bag of protoplasm does this kind of memory exist? So Gunther made a proposal on DNA. He argued that experience is not stored in DNA. Rather, DNA acts as a form of index or a retrieval key. A particular index acts as experience stored in the block time of relativity. So remember, special relativity has the frozen four-dimensional block, past, present, and future all contained, static, but it is block time. So in the 4D past of block time, you would have the entirety of the spider's experience and of all spiders. And just like our experiences of stirring coffee, as I've described throughout this series, it's in all modalities: the optical, the auditory, tactile, kinesthetic, olfactory, emotional. And I noted that, again, all of these events have, just like coffee, an invariant structure. In coffee, we had velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors, crystal invariants, texture gradients, ratios, flows. So we're talking a great deal of structure across all this experience. And an idealized web construction is a form of invariance across all these experiences, just like coffee ultimately has an invariant structure across all experiences of coffee. And that this is what the baby spider taps into via his DNA. Now we'll modify this idea shortly. So the 4D field is, of course, Bergson's model. The top picture there with all this coffee stirring events in the 4D extent of being, and being reintegrated by a current event of coffee stirring that sends, as it were, a wave, a resonant reconstructive wave through all those experiences. Well, we've been showing that for some time. So the transformation of the universal field in Bergson's model is indivisible. There are no discrete instants that fall immediately into the past, that is, into non-existence. There is, in fact, continuous 4D extent. And the body and brain are integrally embedded within this indivisible or non-differentiable transformation. And the brain is acting as a form of reconstructive wave to access this experience. That coffee stirring event is throwing the brain there into a wave form, a reconstructive wave form that reintegrates that coffee experience. Now, the block time concept of special relativity, I noted in long discussion in parts A and part 8A and part 8B, is a completely invalid interpretation of special relativity. It has no validity, nor do we need it. It is indeed a block. It is a block to a useful understanding of time. So we can discard the block time notion, but Bergson's model of the indivisibility of time and the 4D extent of the matter field is what we need, and that's what we can use in this case, simply making a slight substitution for Gunther. So when we look at DNA, it's loaded not only with the responsibility for storing how to make webs, how to hunt flies, how to roll them up in your mesh, where to put webs, etc., etc. Its most important responsibility is the development of the form of the spider, the form and function. From a tiny, teeny egg, that spider has to grow into a full-fledged, crawlable spider. That's the primary function of DNA. So Gunther starts concretely again, imagining a scaled-up cell, because we're giving DNA the responsibility for maintaining the form of everything, from spiders to humans, all the way down to the cell, and even within the cell, the little functional parts of the cell. So imagine scaling up just the cell, just the cell. Imagine the atoms of a cell enlarged to the size of this O, actually slightly smaller than that in print, but composed of 1 trillion atoms A cell, if the mathematical calculations, would be as tall as the World Trade Center, over 100 stories. And the DNA strands would sit in a tiny corner. They'd be 1-inch diameter, very long ropes, 100-mile long ropes or more. How would these strands direct the motion of atoms to maintain the form of a 100-story tower? And furthermore, to assemble yet another 100 trillion different skyscrapers, which ultimately compose eyes, nose, heart, ears, bones, kidneys. You're asking DNA sitting in that little corner to direct all these forces. And remember, these atoms in classical physics, and quantum physics doesn't change this, are viewed as just a bunch of independent billiard balls. So how are they being constrained to all act in this extremely precise, structured way? The cells in the DNA are composed of atoms. The only force physicists say acts on these billiard balls, is the electromagnetic force. So there's a straightforward question. Can such forces actually explain these massive tower assemblies? Could you get a bunch of refrigerator magnets to do this? Remember, these atoms are in constant swirling motion. Yet over all this, these forms are constantly maintained. This is what boggled Schrödinger in his little book, What is Life? These atoms, by the law of entropy, should be descending into chaos, actually into a disordered equilibrium. But they do not. And this is critical. For Schrödinger, there are no laws of physics that can account for this. There must be some force unknown to physics, he argued, that accounts for this. Some force, some field, like a magnet moved under a paper sprinkled with iron filings would pattern the filings. I have a nice dynamic picture of that here, but you can get the idea of a magnet moving underneath a piece of paper of iron filings, and it would cause them to move around into various patterns. It would be a hidden force, the magnet underneath the paper. But it is not an electromagnetic force. In fact, if we take Sperry's word for it, it's not an electromagnetic force, it's something else. Now, biologists, who are far better physicists than Schrödinger, reject this. For example, take Dawkins. Quote, "There's no reason to think that the laws of physics are violated in living matter. There is no life force to rival the fundamental laws of physics. The body is complex. You must apply the law of physics to its parts. The behavior of the body as a whole will emerge as a consequence of the interactions of the parts." It's from The Blind Watchmaker. Gunther quotes this. So, an amazing rejection of Schrödinger, one of the greatest physicists that walked the planet. So how minute are these parts or components, one could ask Dawkins? How deep is this decomposition going to go? A tiny cell itself contains an enormous number of parts just within this cell. And should Dawkins explain even one of these parts, the organization, the constant form being held by one of these parts, and for Schrödinger, he cannot, because the difficulty does not change no matter what the size of the stupid part. In other words, Dawkins' argument is utterly irrelevant to Schrödinger's argument. Nevertheless, just asking for the sake of argument, how long before the improbability of the organization of the whole myriad of parts becomes the issue? And I can't resist noting that, as I noted in part 7, Dawkins also holds that these parts, or the components, they actually cannot be components yet, are available to nature as in a library. And these can be used to construct new organisms. So in the context of creating a mousetrap from arbitrary components, like my crossbow mousetrap there in the picture, well, we can just grab components and create new things like flagellar motors out of them. But even if rather than appealing to random mutations to affect something like this, if he's implicitly invoking some AI-like algorithm, which in reality he is, he's just blind to the problem of common sense knowledge. He's just blundered into that problem and doesn't understand it. But we talked about this in detail in part 7, but it's very much linked to his part argument over, as we just read. So that life is a form of global organizing force is vitalism. And this is another reason, partly, but perhaps the main reason why Bergson is buried. He's just a discredited vitalist. For in creative evolution, he was making these types of arguments. The go-to argument, the organization, this holding together of all these forms, somehow emerges. In fact, I forgot to note that, but that was exactly what Dawkins also argued in the slide just previously, that the organization emerges from all the parts. Just like our conscious perception of the coffee cup supposedly emerges magically from whirling brain atoms. So in other words, we've got just some form of magic being applied to all of this whirling atoms to get a form, our frog. But again, as Gunther notes, you have to remember the forces of a car engine, for example, are rigidly constrained artificially. The forces on the computer that make the computer work, all the electronic flow of electrons, is extremely rigidly constrained artificially. Puncture a cylinder in the engine or snip a wire in the computer, both become functionally useless. But the forces forming and running the trillions of particles in a frog or a cell, what is guiding these? The question remains in force. How does DNA actually direct form across the vast fluid structure of behaviors, web building, migration, cyst capture, and the vast fluid structure or behavior of form, cells, frogs, spider eyes, these themselves simply being behaviors when taken at especially its finest scale of time, the behavior of massive motions of atoms in the cell and the frog. So the problem is the same. Now, Jan McGilchrist, I have to note, was in a wonderful interview with Jordan Peterson on YouTube, and it came out that he was writing a book, the intended title being There Are No Things. That is, all is process or flow. And I'm sure this is going to be a great book, and this entire concept has to be driven in because we're suffering from the lack of its awareness and its implications. Just noting that, of course, Bergson was already there. His little quote form is only a snapshot of change. And this concept is what we've been exploring really underneath the surface for the last many parts, 26 parts so far. This is why Gunther then argued that DNA serves as an index, albeit method unknown at this point, or a retrieval key to fields that build and maintain the organism. The building of a heart, an eye, a cell, a kidney, these are all behavior patterns carried out over space and time, just like the building of a web, or migrating to Mexico as a bird, or oozing over a cyst as an amoeba. Just sans conscious decisions. We can easily identify a being like a spider that's building a web or a bird that's consciously migrating, not so much with respect to the cell, the form of the frog itself. These fields memory patterns indexed by DNA to build and maintain eyes, say for frogs, eyes for spiders, weird eyes for crabs, hearts, lungs, kidneys, also exist in the 4D field. Biologists, that is many, would say no way. Now some are thinking field and approaching this in terms of attractors and mathematical chaos theory, which is to me a little too abstract to get where we have to go. But most would simply say no way. Our magical, Schrödinger-defeating, physics-defying DNA can do all of this. After all, there are the fruit fly experiments, as they would point to. Here are chromosomal mutations to the genes induced by radiation, radiating eggs, changes extinctive behavior. Flies will move away from the light, not towards it as per normal, or they'll hold the wings above the body, not flat on their abdomen as is normal, or they will screw up sex in various ways. But the question is, have you merely screwed up the DNA's ability to serve as an index to the appropriate field when you've done these radiating destructive type things? I mean, this is a possible alternative once you start thinking in terms of indexing fields. The fact that we have loaded so much magic on top of poor DNA has to drive us to consider this alternative view. Now, some folks are certainly saying to me at this point, well, what about Rupert Sheldrake? And yes, indeed, some of this is very close to Rupert Sheldrake and his morphic fields, where these morphic fields guide form development and behavior, like our spiders, and to his statement, quote, nature has a memory, unquote. There are many differences, but here we're focused more on the implications for the brain and human memory than Rupert ever is. Rupert has much focus on the paranormal, which statistically he knows is actually quite normal. And he has interesting arguments on fields, phantom limbs, many arguments for the necessity of fields. But what actually are these fields? Well, he's in as much difficulty and questioning as we are at this point. But this is the question. So assume DNA's role in building of the 13,000 neuron brain via indexing to the appropriate fields. So again, we're assuming that DNA at least is an index to the building of the form, that is, of the spider and the spider's 13,000 neuron brain. So can we unload some of the responsibility of DNA for the web transmission and for how to build webs? Can we take that off DNA? That is, can we unload it to the 13,000 neuron brain? Well, I would say yes. We can postulate that the pattern these brain neurons can assume is now the index, like the redintegrating mechanism, just like the coffee stirring for web construction. And it would be a pattern quite unique to spider brains. Remember, the brain is a reflection. It's also integrally related to all the motor systems of the spider. And so a spider reconstructive wave guided by that brain, shall we say, is going to be quite unique to spiders. And therefore, what they can retrieve from that 4D field is going to be, well, web building. So now we're in the same framework as I already noted as redintegrating coffee stirring events. The invariant structure from the event that's being perceived drives the neural mass. The neural mass dynamically reflects this structure. This drives the reconstructive wave through the 4D memory. And this is why engaging the invariant structure in memory recall theory is so important. Now, whether something externally drives the spider to recall this very, very well could be. I mean, that's why I put a little tree there in front of the baby spider in his brain to get the process going. But that's an interesting question what that might be. And this leads us back to Lashley. and his question, whether the learned sequence of actions was indeed stored in the brain. For presented the pattern event of the maze, just like coffee stirring, as long as the neural mass, no matter how sliced up, could respond with a pattern reflecting this structure, the memory of how to get the hamburger was retrieved. And this takes us to another aspect of Lashley, and that's the syntax of behavior. So Lashley, we saw in number 9, down on the right there, in Free Will, long discussion, slides 12 to 38. Lashley, we saw, considered the problem of the ordered unfoldment of an act. He did this in this famous treatise, The Problem of Serial Order and Behavior, in 1951. To pronounce the word right, he noted, consists in these 3 elements: the retraction and elevation of the tongue, depression of the tongue and jaw, elevating the tongue to the dental ridge, stopping vocalization, etc., etc. He noted that these movements have no intrinsic order of association. Tire, to say the word tire, requires the same movements in reverse order. So the order or syntax is imposed by some organization other than direct associative connections. This is equally true for the letters of a word. The letters R or G or A can occur in any order or combination. The order depends upon a set for a larger unit of action, in this case, the word. The arrangement of the individual elements or words, the order, is determined by a broad scheme of meaning. This holds not only for language, but for all skilled movements. That is, tennis serves, piano playing, golfing, dancing. What then determines the order? Lashley asked. Lashley took the view that the set or the idea does not have a temporal order. That's all of its elements are contemporal or atemporal. Thus, Lashley argued that there are at least 3 sets of things to be accounted for. The activation of the expressive elements, that is, the words, for example, in a sentence, or the pronunciation movements of the vocal tract for speaking a word. Secondly, the determining tendency, that is the set or the temporal idea. And then 3, the syntax of the act, which is a generalized pattern or schema of integration, which may be imposed on a wide range of specific acts, or upon individual components of an act. Now, I also noted that in the 1960s, the great linguistic theorist Noam Chomsky, inspired by Lashley to some degree, would initiate a vast assault on the last one, number 3, the theory of syntax. He proposed a rule system or grammar employed by the brain to unfold the words from the idea in the proper order. The word elements of the sentence, the man stirred the coffee, are unfolded in a certain grammatical order by a set of syntactic rules. And we've got those over on the right. For example, sentence is a noun phrase plus a verb phrase. And in the little hierarchy, we see the S there become a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And a noun phrase is a determiner plus a noun, or determiner being the, a noun being man. And then the verb phrase is rewritten as a verb in a noun phrase. So a verb can be stirred, and then we get another determiner and a noun. The coffee. The man stirred the coffee is a nice rule-generated sentence from that little set of syntactic rules. And it all devolves from S. Now, what is S? Well, I noted that Lashley would not be too impressed because we've ignored his starting point, which is the atemporal idea, which S represents. The no post-Chomskyan computer translation program, which all heavily rely on these nice syntactic rules, in all our subsequent syntactic sophistication, has ever translated a German sentence, which flips the word order all around, into a nice atemporal idea and then freely into English. No computer, no Siri has ever had an atemporal idea. We've had no theory of S, the point from which syntactic structures must evolve into an ordered act. And again, I note, back to our invariant structure, the man stirred the coffee involves an event. That idea is an event, a perceptual event with, again, an invariant structure, which we're free to express from that S, that idea, in any number of ways as well. The man stirred the coffee slowly. The man stirred the coffee with great gusto. The man stirred the coffee and the aroma floated around the room, etc. We can choose to describe what we want from that very rich multimodal idea, which doesn't exist in a computer in a syntactic structure. So we saw this too had already been visited by Bergson in his treatise on dynamic schemes in his article Intellectual Effort in 1924. He gave the example of learning to dance, where we begin with a visual impression of the movement. It's an image to be concretely filled in, articulated, so to speak, by the actual physically performed movements that will comprise the ultimate fluid action. These movements are elementary units that will be coordinated, movements used in walking, lifting up on one's toes, swinging the arms, etc. But the first impression of the dance is an outline of the relations, especially temporal but also spatial, of the successive parts of the movement. So the abstract, atemporal, or contemporal image, if you wish, of the spatial temporal relations is the dynamic scheme in Bergson's terms. So Lashley's atemporal idea, Bergson's dynamic or atemporal scheme, these are creatures of Gunther's block time, or of Bergson's four-dimensionally extended being. These are already elaborated concepts expressing Gunther's movie of experience in block time, guiding behavior. So these were already developed before Gunther. Whether building webs, migrating, performing tennis serves or piano pieces, or speaking a sentence, there is a temporal scheme, and its source is from the same point, the 4D field. So what has happened in the brain once we have practiced again and again, say a dance or Chopin's piano waltz in C-sharp minor? Is there a motor memory which is stored in the brain that is a mechanism of neural connections, such as a neural net, that can be unrolled at will, as the Bergson of 1896 and matter memory thought? It seems not. There is the initial scheme and the completed scheme, as Bergson describes it in 1924. The resultant skill from the effort, remember this is titled Intellectual Effort in this article, is the sharpening, the clarifying of the scheme. So the entire skill, the increasing kinesthetic motor articulation of the fingers, may just be the now clarified multimodal dynamic scheme, to which the body now responds with great alacrity. And while speaking of alacrity, I'm reminded of our discussion in number 9 in free will. Ray altered time via hypnosis, self-induced hypnotic trance, where it seems the scheme may bring about extremely rapid action, just to make things a little more rich with possibilities here. And this also took place in the context of mental practice, where they were doing mental practice again in self-induced altered time to see if they could increase the skill of some action. And they discovered that this was, well, a little bit ambiguous as to the results. But this bullet that we've just been looking at may be the reason why just mental practice is likely insufficient, because the scheme is the record, shall we say, of this extremely concrete set of events. Again, kinesthetic, motor, articulation of the fingers, the contractions, expansions of the muscles, etc., in four-dimensional field. So there are passages galore in Chopin, and I would guess that only massive amounts of purely rote practice attempts would work to achieve them. There's a little etude, for example, Opus 10 number 3, which seems easy enough to play, except one hits a passage. I believe it's a cascade of fourths and fifths. I'd have to look again. But without conceptual grasp of the structure of that passage, it would take forever, I think, to learn by pure non-conceptual rote. But again, the conceptual grasp is equally part of the dynamic scheme. So here's my question. How does Mozart differ from a bird? One is always struck by Mozart's report that in his creative process, say walking along in a park, he would see an entire piece of music, to quote, though it be long, unquote, even as long as a symphony, as though it were a statue. It is laid out like a block in space-time. And all he had to do, he said, is to transcribe it on paper, reading it off from this view. Well, what's the difference here between the bird with his spatial temporal movie of migration and this movie of a symphony that Mozart could access? In his intellectual effort article, Bergson notes Prendergast, technique of language teaching. In this technique, the student only repeats sentences without any effort at comprehension. In fact, attempting to comprehend the sentences is actively discouraged. The sentences are varied in form, where the nouns are placed, verbs, etc. And at some point, the comprehension suddenly comes. Somewhere, I'd swear I saw Bergson curiously pondering the following phenomenon. I cannot find it. It might have just been this particular discussion of Prendergast. But in any case, the phenomenon goes like this. A gal moves to France with no understanding of the language. She frequents the cafes for months. The surrounding conversations are just a buzzing confusion of sounds. Suddenly, one day, in a moment, everything that's being said in the cafe around her is perfectly clear and understood. I know my wife, Susan, has an acquaintance that had somewhat of a similar experience, and I discovered that the acquaintance actually wrote a little book that incorporated the experience. Now, the difference here is that she was an exchange student trying to learn the language and having great difficulty, but similarly, sitting in a cafe one day, suddenly everything that was being said was instantly clear. So my wonder is this, is the entire matrix, so to speak, of the French language in the 4D field, the experience of learning, understanding French, such that this entire matrix can be accessed in an instant. Now there's another thing we can bring in with these dynamic schemes, and that relates to the very problem of recognition. We've noted that deep learning nets exhibit a tolerant, what's termed a tolerant form of recognition, but yet a very problematic form of recognition. For example, the neural net will classify images and recognize cars parked along the side of the road. So those two are cars parked, but then it'll recognize or classify the car in the ocean as a car parked, or the car floating above the road is car parked, or on the retaining wall is a car parked. In other words, it's too tolerant. It doesn't have a concept of cars parked. Similarly, with recognizing our penguin up there, the net will not be able to recognize that penguin in various states or slices of that rotation. That is, the slant problem still remains, or the scaling problem. Then that would have to be adjusted somehow to recognize the same penguin at a completely different scale. So etched in my memory is a talk given at the University of Minnesota around 1972 by Michael Turvey, a premier ecological psychologist in the Gibson mode and a good friend of my advisor, Bob Shaw. And the subject of his talk was basically, what does it mean to recognize an A? How do we recognize the letter A? And he went through, of course, all of the different forms of A's that we recognize. There's tons of them, and I'm only showing a few of the possible slants, tilts, etc. of A's that we still recognize as A's. We easily solve the slant, the tilt problem. And he ended by saying, we recognize an A because we know how to make an A. We have the understanding, and we'll call it provisionally motor understanding, of how to make an A. The difficulty is this know-how is independent of any particular muscles or method, as he pointed out. I can make an A with my mouth, with my toe, with a giant tree in the sand, or a giant pencil like our figure is doing. Now, again, what does that sound like? It sounds like the dynamic scheme. The very problem Lashley was referring to, how the rats could still, in other words, if we put this in the rat framework, the rat could still make an A despite the fact that he hasn't got a toe, or he can make it with his mouth, or he can use a giant tree in the sand, depending on the size of the rat. It's like learning in the music framework, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on the piano. Once the scheme of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is grasped, I can play it with my nose, with my toes, and with a pencil. Now, obviously, if I'm trying to play Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 5, I can't play with my toes and my pencil because I just can't make all the notes simultaneously that way. But given a scheme that can be achieved in other modes, we can do it. So we're beginning to see how the concept of dynamic schemes, as far out as this seems to be, very likely has to be brought into the very problem of recognition. So the possibility is there's a spectrum, and it goes like this. The less the complexity of neural structure, say an amoeba, say a spider starting at the bottom of the scale, then the greater the direct access to experience within the 4D field. We term this instinctual or instinctual memory, though we know that even the spider quickly gains access to his own experience, his own web building and hunting knowledge. The greater the complexity of neural structure, the less the direct access to experience within the 4D field, the greater the reliance on individual memory, but thus the greater the individual freedom, the greater the leeway to develop individuality. And of course, if you're a robot in the machine conception of mind, then you have zero direct access. You don't have the reintegrative, reconstructive wave ability to do this at all. Now, Bergson asked always, why is memory limited? This is the real question. That is, why are we not aware of our entire experience as though we're just a long sentence to which we are listening, like this sentence right now? And he saw that the brain appears to be designed to actually limit memory through its great degree of complexity. Though with little tricks like Prendergast, we seem to be able to trick it into bringing in this direct access, or if we're perhaps someone like Sachs twins. Of course, this brings up the question, How do these fields act upon the brain? How do they bring about action? How does the image, how does the scheme bring about action in the brain? So Gunther spends some time on Sir John Eccles, a neurophysiologist, Nobel Prize winner. And for Eccles, a non-physical mind acts within the fuzzy realm of quantum uncertainty to influence the probability of neurotransmitter release. He saw the tips of neurons as being like little antennae tuned to the non-physical, and the release of a tiny bubble of neurotransmitter is like the action of a tiny lever. Now I note Lashley was not here in the non-physical. Lashley was not proposing non-physical fields, but rather very physical fields, as we saw, perhaps EM fields. But Bergson was similar. He spoke of the matter of the brain as being delicately arranged as a trigger, like Eccles' little levers, such that it could respond to the image, that is, to the dynamic scheme, or as has been shown often, our little cat dreaming responding to the image of the mouse, and that dream image bringing about action in the cat's body. However, at the end of intellectual effort, Bergson challenges our notions of and concepts of causality, especially philosophical concepts of causality in this regard, and in this context of the gradual passage from the less realized to the more realized, or from the intensive to the extensive, or from a reciprocal implication of parts to their juxtaposition or articulation, or the growing materialization of the immaterial, which is a characteristic of vital activity. So, in other words, he was starting to take this to a much different, more profound level in respect to causality itself. Now, Henry Stapp, the mindful universe, developed a QM-based theory for consciousness and consciousness bringing about action. And I did review this on Amazon, but my little point here is simply that, from my perception, these theories, especially by physicists, just tend to have too narrow a view of what has to be explained. But that's all I want to say here. But this is why I've been insistent that we need to understand the nature of the field in which we, in the brain, are embedded integrally. We noted in number 22 on fields that a field has no physical properties. So with Eccles, we can say non-physical, as though we're dealing with a duality. But matter, as we glimpsed in number 22, is an expression of integrally embedded in this field, that is the ether, that has no physical properties, which is to say we're not truly dealing with a duality. And hence, this is why Bergson's concept at the end, at intellectual effort, of exploring more deeply the very nature of causality, starts to indicate the direction we have to move. So, in conclusion, the remarkable implication of Lashley, that there are no engraved circuits being formed in the brain which support an environment action memory. By that I mean like the rat seeing the maze and knowing what to do. Where this memory is still an open question. Instinctual memory, the memory of spiders, is supposedly encoded in DNA. Yet this is a massive dumping on poor DNA of a vast 4D multimodal experience with no mechanism to actually do so. Reverse transcription not being the mechanism either. The problem of the instinctual forces us to consider that this memory is stored elsewhere, that it is a dynamic scheme defined over the experience of spiders, or our own experience as piano practice, where, do I have to stay in the spider world here, where in an indivisibly transforming universal field, this past is not consigned to non-existence. Simultaneously, the instinctual memory and the personal memory work in a common way. In both, the being, whether us or spider, is accessing dynamic schemes existing in the 4D field. In the piano waltz case of the dance, the scheme may be initially vague, in fact not already existing in the 4D field, but we've come up with it, but ultimately extremely precise. What is the actual nature of these schemes, of the fields they might form, how they act in the brain, how they guide and constrain form, open questions. We've broken a bit with Bergson in that even motor memories may not be stored. More precisely, I think we've seen how the Bergson of 1924, intellectual effort, broke rather significantly with the Bergson of 1896. And unfortunately, he did not return to the question of the storage of motor memories. The discussion of explicit memory and amnesia as not destruction to stored experience, that is, amnesia not causing damage to experience, so storage supposedly in the brain, remains unchanged. What is happening via various neural damage, not just the results of amnesia, but damage that causes loss of various recognitions, say of objects, categories of words. Well, this is a subject for another part of memory. And there's another obvious question that all being astute listeners have probably been yelling at me. How do we explain spider number 1? If the baby's ability to create webs derives from a dynamic scheme defined over the experience of spiders, well, how did the first spider create a web? Where did the original schema come from? This, of course, is part of the general set of questions around evolution, to include how is the form/function of the spider established in the first place, just a spider, the form and functions even of a cell, Schrödinger's profound question as well. But this aside, we have surely seen again how limited, how likely misguided is the AI, computer, robotic conception of the mind and memory of humanity and of spiders. So down the road, definitely physics and the holographic principle. I keep running into this. Time travel, Bergson's implications, yes, no, partially. Definitely more in current memory research in some of these questions we've been looking at. Temporal consciousness from a philosophical point of view, and the origin of the very notion of quanta, and of course something else. What appears to be next here? Well, we've got to get to Heidegger and Bergson, the comparison, or what I like to call the throwdown. So, till next time in that subject, signing off.